Welcome to the Deep Dive. We sift through sources to pull out the key insights, getting you up to speed quickly. Today, we're looking at something, well, pretty unexpected in Christian apologetics, using math, specifically Bayes' theorem, to argue the probability of Jesus' resurrection. Yeah, the main figure here is Michael Jones from the Inspiring Philosophy YouTube channel. He's making a really big claim that he can mathematically prove the resurrection is more likely than any natural explanation. It's definitely caused a stir. Our main source of this deep dive is an essay by Skylar Fiction called From Faithful Skepticism, a Christian Response to the Bayesian Resurrection Argument. And our goal today is to really dig into Jones's argument, but the critique is coming from an interesting place. Skylar Fiction identifies as a Christian pantheist. They believe in the resurrection, but they're seriously questioning this whole method of trying to prove it with numbers. It's framed as faithful inquiry. Okay. So the big question is, can you really boil down a sacred mystery to a mathematical formula? The author argues faith needs spiritual authenticity, not math proofs.
That the resurrection is something to be lived, not solved like an equation. It's this tension between logic and faith we're exploring. Okay, let's dive into the argument itself then. For anyone listening who hasn't come across this, what is Michael Jones's Bayesian resurrection argument? What's he actually claiming?
Right. So Jones uses Bayes' theorem, that mathematical process for updating how likely you think something is based on new evidence. He applies it to argue that the resurrection hypothesis, let's call it R, is mathematically way more probable than any naturalistic alternative not R. He's aiming for near certainty, really.
Okay, near certainty. And what's the foundation? What's he building this on?
Well, there are two main things. First, something he calls the historical reportage model, the HRM. This basically assumes the Gospels and other early Christian writings are independent, sincere, and historically accurate accounts. Second, he feeds what he calls maximal data from the New Testament into his Bayesian calculation.
Maximal data, like what?
Things like the crucifixion, stories of Jesus appearing after his death, the empty tomb tradition, and crucially, how belief in the resurrection just exploded really quickly among the first Christians. And here's the really bold part. Jones argues that even if you start with an absolutely tiny probability for the resurrection, like astronomically small, say 1 in 10 to the 40th power.
Wow, okay, tiny.
Yeah, ridiculously small. He claims the evidence, when plugged into the Bayesian formula as likelihood ratios, is so strong it can still push the probability of the resurrection way, way up. But, and this is the core of Skylar Fiction's critique, this whole thing hangs on some pretty big assumptions that really need a closer look.
Okay, so what are those assumptions? What's being challenged here?
Skylar Fiction points out 4 key ones. First, this historical reportage model, the idea that the Gospels are basically independent, reliable history. Second, that the maximal data, things like group appearances or conversions of enemies like Paul, are actual historical facts, not maybe literary devices or theological points.
Right.
Third, and this is a big one, whether you can even use Bayesian logic properly for a unique, unrepeatable metaphysical event, like a miracle. Is it the right tool? And fourth, the assumption that all the other explanations, hallucinations, myth-making, legends, are just so incredibly unlikely that they basically don't stand a chance against the resurrection hypothesis.
Got it. So the author's main worry is that Jones is kind of overselling the certainty.
Exactly. The essay argues Jones overstates its certainty by misapplying mathematical reasoning to theological literature. And the risk, according to the author, is losing the sense of awe and humility that's central to faith. It's a critique trying to protect faith, not attack the resurrection itself. Which brings us to a really fundamental question. Is Bayes' theorem even the right kind of tool for something like the resurrection? The source makes a strong point that Bayes' theorem really shines when you're dealing with things you can observe repeatedly in fairly stable situations.
Like what? Give us some examples.
Oh, things like weather forecasting, or figuring out the chance of a disease based on symptoms, or even genetics. Stuff where you have frequencies, data sets you can test against.
Okay, repeatable patterns.
Precisely. Now, contrast that with a one-off, unique metaphysical claim like God raising Jesus from the dead. The resurrection, in theological terms, isn't presented as a statistical pattern. It's an assertion about God acting in history. It's not something you can test or repeat or verify like a scientific hypothesis.
But Jones tries to account for that, right? By including background knowledge, like belief in God or messianic prophecies, to sort of boost the initial probability.
He does, yeah. But the critique sees that as stacking the deck.
How so?
Well, the author argues it's essentially wrapping a theological belief system inside a mathematical formula. It gives this illusion of objectivity, but the The starting point is already heavily influenced by the conclusion you want to reach.
So the numbers aren't as objective as they might seem.
Especially the likelihoods Jones assigns. He might say the chance of the disciples having hallucinations is incredibly low, like less than 0.001, while the chance they saw the actual resurrected Jesus is very high, maybe over 0.8.
Where do those numbers come from?
That's the issue. The critique is that they seem to come largely from Jones's own intuition about what's plausible. They aren't based on, say, large-scale psychological studies of grief hallucinations or agreed-upon historical methods. Historians just don't usually talk in these kinds of precise numbers.
Right, because how could you get precise numbers for something like that? It seems like intuition has to play some role in history, doesn't it? How does the author deal with that?
Well, the author's point is that if intuition is driving the numbers, then the math isn't really proving anything independently. It's more like a formal way of expressing pre-existing beliefs. If the numbers aren't grounded in something empirical or widely agreed upon, the model risks becoming circular. You get the answer you expect because you put in numbers that lead to it.
So it just confirms your bias, essentially.
In a way, yes. Skylar Fiction suggests a better path for understanding a miracle isn't trying to quantify it, but exploring its meaning within its theological context, its impact, its story, rather than forcing it into a scientific box it doesn't fit.
It makes me think of David Hume's point about miracles.
Exactly. Hume argued you shouldn't believe testimony for a miracle unless the testimony being false would be even more miraculous. The resurrection, by its very nature, is presented as an anomaly, something outside the normal run of things. It's a claim based on revelation, really.
So fundamentally, it belongs more to faith than math.
That's the argument, and the danger identified is that this Bayesian approach offers a kind of false sense of certainty. It swaps wonder for calculations, awe with algorithm. Think about the early church. They didn't win converts with probability charts. It was about transformed lives, courage, community, a sense of spiritual power. The resurrection wasn't the QED at the end of a proof. It was the starting point for a whole new way of living.
So the author lands pretty firmly on this point.
Yes. The quote sums it up. The question is not whether Bayes' theorem can be used to talk about the resurrection. Mathematically, it can, but the deeper question is whether it should. And the answer, I believe, is no.
Okay, let's shift gears a bit and look at Jones's reliance on the New Testament texts themselves. He argues they're textually sound, historically reliable, basically good evidence for his model.
Yeah, that's absolutely crucial for his argument. If the source documents aren't stable or reliable reports, the whole Bayesian structure built on them kind of falls apart.
So for someone who does see these texts as pretty straightforward history, what's the disconnect Skylar Fiction points out? Is it just about minor variations in manuscripts?
It goes deeper than just minor textual variants. While, yes, textual critics generally agree the text we have is very close to early versions, the author argues that textual stability doesn't automatically mean historical accuracy or objective reporting. The key point is how these specific texts became the canon. It wasn't a neutral process. It involved selective inclusion, theological preference, and ecclesial control. It tells us what certain groups preserved and promoted.
So stability doesn't equal truth.
As the essay puts it, referencing From Scroll to Scripture, stability does not equal truth. It only shows us what the dominant voices protected. The collection itself is shaped by choices.
Okay, that leads into a core part of Jones's method, this idea of multiple independent attestation. Can you break that down for us? How does he use it?
The basic idea is pretty intuitive. If you have several witnesses who supposedly didn't coordinate their stories, all reporting the same strange event, like seeing someone risen from the dead, it makes the event seem much more likely. Each independent report strengthens the case.
And how does that fit into Bayes' theorem?
In Bayesian terms, you can multiply the likelihoods. So if one report makes the resurrection, say, 10 times more likely, and another independent report also makes it 10 times more likely, combined they make it 100 times more likely. It ramps up fast.
But the source calls this an illusion of multiplication. Why?
Because the independence is highly questionable, especially with the Gospels. The vast majority of New Testament scholars accept Mark in priority, the idea that Matthew and Luke both used Mark's Gospel as a major source.
So they weren't independent witnesses.
Not in the way the model requires. They were often copying Mark, sometimes word for word in Greek, other times adapting his material for their own theological points or audiences. So when Matthew and Luke describe the empty tomb, for example, they're largely editing Mark's account, not providing separate, corroborating testimony based on different sources.
So treating them as independent is like counting the same witness 3 times.
Pretty much, yeah. The essay is quite direct. If 3 out of the 4 Gospels derive their core resurrection narratives from a common literary ancestor, then their reports cannot be treated as separate pieces of evidence. It violates the core logic of multiplying probabilities based on independence.
And beyond just the sourcing, the accounts themselves have some pretty major differences, don't they?
Oh, absolutely. Big differences.
Yeah.
Mark ends with the women fleeing the tomb in terror and telling no one. Matthew has them meet Jesus on the road and worship him. Luke has the women's report dismissed initially, and then Jesus appears on the road to Emmaus. John has Mary Magdalene alone at the tomb first, talking to angels, then Jesus.
Those aren't just small details.
Not at all. The author calls them signs of narrative drift, suggesting they reflect the different theological aims of each writer, rather than a consistent journalistic account of a single event.
What about Paul? His account in 1 Corinthians 15 is often presented as very early and independent. How does the essay address that?
It points out that Paul himself describes his experience not as seeing a physical body, but as a revelation. He was pleased to reveal his son in me, is how Paul puts it elsewhere. It was more visionary, more mystical.
So maybe not the same kind of evidence as a physical appearance claim.
Potentially not direct evidence for a physical resurrection in the way Jones uses it. Plus, Paul wasn't operating in a vacuum. He was part of the same early Christian movement, interacting with the same communities and traditions, even if his experience was unique. They weren't totally separate streams. They were overlapping theological networks.
Okay, so the takeaway here is that the evidence isn't as independent as the Bayesian model requires.
That's the core critique. Feeding these accounts, which the author describes as theologically entangled, literarily derived, and symbolically interdependent, into a model that assumes independence creates a misleading result. Multiplying the probabilities gives the illusion of convergence, but it is a mathematical mirage built on circular assumptions. The bottom line, 5 retellings of the same tradition do not equal 5 witnesses.
Let's dig a bit deeper into this idea of the canon itself not being a neutral data set. You mentioned selection and control earlier.
Right. It's really important to grasp that the New Testament as we have it isn't just a random collection of early Christian writings. It's a product of centuries of debate, theological battles, decisions by church councils. Power dynamics played a huge role.
And early Christianity wasn't monolithic, was it? There were different views on resurrection itself.
Absolutely. You had Paul sometimes talking about a spiritual body quite different from the later emphasis in Luke and John on a very physical flesh and bone resurrection. You had texts like the Gospel of Thomas, which had sayings of Jesus but focused on inner knowledge, not a bodily resurrection narrative. Many different voices, different theologies.
And only some of those made it into the official collection.
Exactly. The process of deciding which books were in and which were out canonization wasn't about historical verification in a modern sense. It was, as the source puts it, a theological sorting mechanism. It prioritized texts that aligned with what became Orthodox doctrine, texts that helped forge a common identity for the growing church. The data Jones uses is therefore pre-processed, filtered through these centuries of theological choices.
But wasn't the wide circulation of the Gospels and Paul's letters a factor? Jones might argue their popularity suggests authenticity.
Popularity, yes. But the essay cautions against equating popularity with historical truth. Which texts survived and spread was also influenced by things like which communities had more resources, eventual imperial support for certain Christian factions, and the active suppression of texts deemed heretical.
Like the Gospel of Thomas being buried, literally.
Precisely. So the very data set Jones relies on is skewed. It represents the winners of those theological battles. The author puts it starkly. Bayesian logic assumes that the data being entered represents the whole picture. In this case, it doesn't. It represents what 4th century councils wanted Christians to believe about 1st century events. Using this filtered data for a probability calculation is like doing climate research on cherry-picked weather reports.
Okay, that's a strong critique of the data itself.
And it leads to another fascinating point the author raises, a fundamental category confusion. Meaning, Jones is treating a religious mystery, something deeply symbolic and experiential, as if it's a scientific hypothesis you can test and verify. The earliest Christians, the essay argues, didn't just see resurrection as a historical factoid. It was loaded with meaning, a symbol of cosmic renewal, a story that speaks not only to what happened, but to what it means.
So the purpose of telling these stories wasn't just to say, hey, this happened.
Not primarily, no. It was about shaping the identity of the community, offering hope, calling people out of despair, testifying to this feeling of God's transformative presence. The stories were theological centers, not police reports.
You can see that in Paul, right?
Definitely. In 1 Corinthians 15, resurrection isn't just about Jesus' body. It's the start of something huge, a spiritual transformation, God's vindication of Jesus, the beginning of a new creation. It's a whole paradigm shift.
And even the gospel stories seem less focused on just proving it happened.
Right. Think about the Emmaus Road story in Luke. The disciples only recognize Jesus in the breaking of the bread, a clear reference to the Eucharist, to ritual. Recognition comes through community practice, not just seeing.
Or John, where Jesus breathes on them and says, receive the Holy Spirit.
Exactly. It links resurrection directly to the experience of the Spirit in the community. The narratives are constantly asking, what does this mean for us? Not just, did it happen exactly like this?
And Bayesian math isn't really equipped for meaning, is it?
Not really. It works with binaries.
Yeah.
Yes and no. True, false. Empty tomb or not. Bodily appearance or not. It is not designed to capture symbolic resonance or existential power. The author suggests the real truth of these stories isn't in whether you can prove them like a math problem, but in their power to transform lives.
Which connects back to how people actually came to believe in the first place.
Yeah, the essay emphasizes that belief seems to have spread through experiential encounter. Through prayer, shared memory and community, the rituals like the Eucharist, seeing lives changed. Not through sifting archaeological evidence or calculating probabilities. People believed Jesus was risen because they met him in some profound sense.
So Jones's approach is offering the wrong kind of tool for the job.
That's the conclusion here. It offers a statistical model when what is needed is a spiritual grammar. It gives mathematical confidence where the gospel offers relational call. It misses the point, in a way.
Okay, so after all this critique, the questions about the math, the sources, the canon, the very nature of resurrection, where does that leave things? If you can't prove it mathematically, what's left for faith?
Well, according to Skylar Fiction, the answer is everything. The point of the critique isn't to destroy faith, but to ground it more honestly. It leads towards a faith based on meaningful encounter, moral transformation, and existential hope, rather than reliance on potentially shaky statistical arguments.
And there's maybe even a danger in that mathematical certainty approach.
The author thinks so. What happens if new evidence does emerge? A manuscript discovery, an archaeological find that changes the interpretation of first-century Jerusalem burials. If your faith is built entirely on the current numbers holding up, it becomes very fragile.
A faith built on probability could crumble if the probability shifts.
Exactly. Whereas the essay argues biblical faith is more about relational trust, spiritual hunger, and openness to divine encounter. Things that data alone can't really capture or satisfy. Faith in the resurrection survived and spread, the author contends, because it changed people's lives, it offered hope, it inspired acts of love and justice, love stronger than death.
So Jones's attempt, while maybe well-intentioned, ends up reducing the mystery.
That's the perspective. It turns it into a theorem to be solved. But the gospel stories themselves don't start with proofs. They start with a cry, a weeping woman, a burning heart on the road, and a stranger breaking bread. These aren't presented as data points for verification. They're invitations into a relationship, into a new reality.
It's interesting, even the story of Thomas demanding proof.
Right, John 20. Thomas needs the empirical evidence, the physical touch. And Jesus offers it, but then says, "Blessed are those who have not seen and yet have come to believe."
Not saying belief is irrational, but
that trust can go beyond what you can physically prove or measure. It's a call to a different kind of knowing relational trust.
And for the author, writing from that Christian Cantheist viewpoint, what does resurrection ultimately signify?
It signifies something ongoing, God's ongoing emergence in all life. It's Christ rising in us whenever justice breaks through despair, whenever love lifts what violence tried to crush. It's not just a past event, but a present reality we participate in.
So the final thought here is not about rejecting the resurrection.
Not at all. It's about how we relate to it. The author's stance is, we do not believe because the numbers tell us to. We believe because we have seen the wounded healed, the lonely embraced, the broken made whole, not in a laboratory, but in life, in community, in the trembling mystery of grace.
Rejecting the method, not the mystery.
Exactly. We reject the Bayesian Resurrection Argument not because we reject the resurrection, but because we refuse to make faith bow to a statistical idol. The call is clear, not by proving it, but by practicing it.